Pam Bondi stepped onto the stage with the confidence of someone who had done her homework. She wasn't there to play politics as usual. She was there to lay out the facts with precision, and from the moment she opened her mouth, it was clear. She meant business. The audience leaned in, sensing that this wasn't going to be just another political discussion. She began by addressing the topic at hand, her voice steady but firm. With each word, she peeled back layers of political narratives that had been spun for years, exposing the contradictions buried beneath them. She spoke with a conviction that made it impossible to ignore. Every claim was backed by undeniable facts, and as she laid them out, it became increasingly clear that she was painting a picture that couldn't be refuted. There was no hesitation as she moved from one point to the next. Each statement was like a well-aimed arrow, hitting the target with pinpoint accuracy. The audience reacted in waves, some nodding in agreement, others shifting in their seats, realizing that this wasn't just rhetoric. This was a full-scale takedown. She didn't need to raise her voice or resort to dramatics. Her words carried weight on their own, each sentence crafted to dismantle the carefully curated image that had been built over the years. She knew the history well, every misstep, every contradiction, every moment that had been brushed aside or rewritten, and she brought them to light with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. The moment that made the room sit up even straighter came when she pointed out a pattern, one that had been evident for years but rarely confronted so directly. She laid out the timeline, connecting dots that had always been there but were often ignored. The truth had been hiding in plain sight, and she was simply bringing it to the forefront where it could no longer be denied. She wasn't delivering an opinion. She was presenting evidence. There was a difference, and that difference was impossible to overlook. The facts spoke for themselves, and she had no problem letting them do the talking. Every word was measured, every example carefully chosen to drive the point home without room for rebuttal. It was a masterclass in debate, not because she was the loudest in the room, but because she was the most prepared. There was no need for exaggeration or theatrics when the truth was compelling enough on its own. The audience could sense that this wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about making sure the facts were finally heard without interference. With each passing moment, it became harder to deny what was being laid out. The points were too well structured, the narrative too strong to be dismissed. Even those who had entered the discussion with preconceived notions found themselves grappling with the weight of the evidence. There was a brief attempt to counter her arguments, but it was swiftly deflected with an even stronger rebuttal. Every deflection was met with a clearer explanation, every vague response countered with precise details. There was no escape from the reality she was presenting, and the tension in the room only grew stronger. It was a rare moment in political discourse, one where substance overpowered spin, where facts carried more weight than talking points. It was the kind of exchange that left an impact long after the cameras stopped rolling, the kind that couldn't be easily brushed aside with a clever soundbite. The more she spoke, the more undeniable the truth became. The audience, whether they agreed with her or not, recognized that this wasn't someone speaking from emotion alone. This was someone who had done the work, who had the receipts, and who wasn't afraid to lay them all out for the world to see. The moment started with an attempt at control, a familiar strategy often used to shift the conversation in a more favorable direction. There was an interruption, a brief moment where the usual playbook was put into action, a dismissive remark, a strategic pivot, an effort to steer the discussion back into safer waters. But this time, it didn't work. Without hesitation, the response came swift and sharp. It wasn't aggressive, nor was it shouted over the noise of the room. It was delivered with an unshakable certainty, the kind that stopped everything in its tracks. A single line cutting through the noise with such precision that the room itself seemed to still for a second. The expression on the other side of the exchange said everything. Eyes widened for a fraction of a second, lips parted as if forming a reply, but no words came. The silence that followed was deafening. The audience reacted almost immediately. There was a mix of responses. Some gasped, others murmured, while a few burst into outright laughter. The weight of what had just been said settled over the space like a tidal wave, and for the first time in the exchange, the balance of control had shifted entirely. What had started as an attempt to brush aside a difficult point had instead resulted in a public reckoning, and there was no easy way out. What made the moment so powerful wasn't just the content of the remark. It was the timing, the delivery, the way it dismantled the very foundation of the argument that had been put forward. It wasn't just a counterpoint. It was a complete exposure of hypocrisy, a reminder that actions had consequences and that words, no matter how carefully curated, couldn't erase reality. The reaction that followed was just as telling. There was an attempt to recover, to regain composure and push forward as if nothing had happened. But it was already too late. The moment had shifted the dynamic of the entire conversation, and everyone in the room knew it. The energy had changed. What had once been confidence was now hesitation, and every response that followed felt like an attempt to reclaim lost ground rather than a continuation of a strong position. It was a rare occurrence to see such an unfiltered truth laid bare in such a public setting. Usually these moments were carefully managed, spun into something else before they had time to take hold. But this time, there was no escaping it. The cameras were rolling, the audience was locked in, and the words that had just been spoken weren't going to be forgotten anytime soon. What made it even more impactful was the contrast. On one side, there was a history of carefully scripted narratives, of well-practiced responses designed to deflect and redirect. On the other, there was a response that required no preparation, no strategic maneuvering, just the simple power of truth spoken plainly, and the result was undeniable. There was a brief moment where it seemed like a retort might come, some kind of comeback to undo the damage, but even that hesitation made it clear. There was no real response. Anything said in return would only draw more attention to what had just happened. The smartest move at that point was to move on, to try to pretend it hadn't landed as hard as it had. But the audience wasn't going to let that happen. As the conversation continued, the effects of that moment lingered. Confidence had been replaced with caution, each word now chosen more carefully, as if the realization had set in that another misstep could lead to an even bigger disaster. But the damage had already been done. The moment had been captured, reactions had been recorded, and there was no undoing the fact that, for once, the script had been torn apart in real time. Even as the discussion carried on, it was clear that the defining moment had already passed. Everything else was just an attempt at cleanup, an effort to shift focus onto something else. But it wasn't going to work. The audience had already witnessed what had happened, and no amount of redirection could erase the impact of those few perfectly chosen words. The reaction from the audience was immediate. Some gasped, others erupted into laughter, while a few exchanged looks of stunned disbelief. The moment had hit like a lightning strike, and there was no way to ignore the energy that had just surged through the room. It wasn't just about the words that had been spoken, it was the way they landed, the way they shattered the carefully maintained facade that had been constructed over the years. At first, there was a brief attempt to brush it off, a nervous chuckle, a quick shift in posture, as if pretending that nothing had really happened. But it was too late. The weight of the moment had settled, and the shift in the room was undeniable. Every person watching could feel it. This was one of those rare instances where the usual rules of political discourse no longer applied. This wasn't just another back-and-forth exchange filled with vague talking points and rehearsed rebuttals. This was something else entirely. The response had been so swift, so precise, that it had left no room for a comeback. It wasn't just a contradiction or a counterpoint. It was an exposure. It was the unveiling of something that had been there all along, but had never been confronted in such a direct and public way. And now that it had been said, there was no taking it back. The audience fed off the energy of the moment. Some clapped. Others murmured among themselves, while a few sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. It was a rare sight, one that didn't happen often in these types of discussions. Usually these exchanges were predictable, with each side sticking to their rehearsed lines and carefully crafted narratives. But this time, the script had been torn apart, and no one was quite sure what would happen next. The person on the receiving end of the comment struggled to maintain composure. There was an attempt at a smile, a quick glance to the side, as if searching for a way to regain control. But control had already been lost, and the room knew it. The dynamic had shifted completely, and there was no easy way to recover from what had just happened. For the next few moments, the tension in the air was almost palpable. The conversation moved forward, but the audience wasn't as engaged in what was being said now. They were still processing the moment that had just unfolded, replaying it in their minds, whispering about it to the person next to them. Some were still grinning, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others sat quietly, their expressions unreadable. But one thing was certain. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. As the discussion continued, every word that followed felt different. There was no longer the same confidence, the same level of certainty in the delivery. There was hesitation now, a cautiousness that hadn't been there before. It was clear that the impact of that moment had rattled even the most seasoned of political players, and for the audience that made it all the more powerful. It wasn't just about the words themselves, it was about what they represented. It was about the rare instance where someone had spoken a truth so undeniable, so unfiltered, that it cut through all the noise and landed with unmistakable force. In a world where political conversations were often carefully staged and controlled, this was something different. This was raw, this was real, and this was something that couldn't be spun or rewritten. For the rest of the exchange, there was an underlying tension that never fully faded. Every response that came afterward felt like an attempt to rebuild what had just been dismantled. But the problem was, once something like that happens, it can't be undone. The audience had seen behind the curtain, and no amount of carefully chosen words could make them unsee it. Even as the discussion wrapped up, it was clear that the defining moment had already taken place. The words had been spoken, the reaction had unfolded, and nothing that followed could erase the impact. It was one of those rare moments that would be replayed, analyzed, and remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. The crowd knew it. The person on the receiving end of the remark knew it, and most importantly, the one who delivered it knew it too. The moment had already shifted the atmosphere in the room, but what followed made it clear that the damage was irreparable. A forced chuckle, an attempt to brush it off as if it were nothing, but the weight of the exchange lingered. There was no easy way to recover, no clever pivot that could undo what had just happened. The balance of control had shifted completely, and everyone knew it. As the discussion moved forward, the discomfort became increasingly obvious. The carefully curated confidence that had been displayed earlier had cracked, replaced with something far more uncertain. Posture stiffened, eyes darted around the room, searching for a way to redirect the conversation. But there was no avoiding what had just happened. The audience had witnessed it, and their reaction had cemented the significance of the moment. The energy in the room was undeniable. Some members of the audience were still grinning, whispering among themselves, while others simply sat in stunned silence, absorbing what had just unfolded. A few tried to downplay the moment, laughing it off, but it was clear that the impact was lasting. The initial shock had passed, but the weight of the words spoken still hung in the air like an unshakable presence. An attempt was made to regain footing, to steer the conversation back into familiar territory. A well-practiced talking point was delivered, something meant to re-establish control, to smooth over the tension that had taken hold, but it fell flat. The delivery lacked the same conviction it had earlier. It felt like an afterthought, a desperate grasp for stability in a situation where it had already been lost. The audience noticed. They weren't just listening anymore, they were watching. Watching every movement, every reaction, every flicker of uncertainty that played across the face of the one who had just been dismantled. And the more they watched, the clearer it became. The moment had changed everything. The awkwardness only grew as the discussion continued. There was an unspoken understanding in the room. No matter how many words were spoken after, they would never erase what had just happened. The attempt to continue as if nothing was wrong only made the discomfort more obvious. Every pause, every hesitation, every nervous glance reinforced the reality that the power in the room had shifted permanently. There was no graceful exit from this moment, no well-crafted closing remark that could restore the authority that had been lost. The usual tactics of control and deflection were useless now. The attempt to move forward felt more like an obligation than a true continuation of the conversation. The room was no longer engaged in what was being said. They were still stuck on what had already been said. As the discussion wrapped up, the final moments were telling. Normally, there would be a confident smile, a firm handshake, an air of self-assurance that left the impression of control. But not this time. This time, there was hesitation, a brief moment of uncertainty, a glance downward, a subtle shift in expression, a realization that there was no coming back from what had just occurred. The audience caught every detail. They saw the small signs that revealed the truth. The person who had entered the discussion with an air of dominance was now exiting with something else entirely, a quiet, undeniable acknowledgement of defeat. The words spoken during the exchange would be replayed, analyzed, and remembered far longer than any planned remarks or scripted responses. And as the cameras cut away, as the event officially ended, the lingering energy in the room made one thing clear. This was not just another debate. This was a moment that would not be forgotten. As the discussion came to a close, the weight of what had transpired remained heavy in the air. There was no undoing the moment that had defined the exchange, no erasing the impact it had left on the audience. Some tried to move on as if it had been just another political back and forth, but it was clear that this was different. It wasn't just about words. It was about truth, about exposure, about a reality that had been laid bare for all to see. Even as the cameras turned away and the event officially concluded, the energy in the room lingered. Some members of the audience were still whispering, replaying the moment in their minds, exchanging glances that spoke volumes. Others sat in silence, absorbing what had just unfolded, realizing they had witnessed something that would be discussed long after the night was over. For the one who had found themselves on the receiving end of the takedown, the exit was telling. The usual confidence had been replaced by something else entirely, an awareness that the moment had been lost, that the attempt to maintain control had slipped away. The smile was forced, the handshake less firm, the posture slightly less assured. It was a small but undeniable shift, one that revealed everything. And for the one who had delivered the response that changed everything, there was no need for further commentary. The words had spoken for themselves. There was no need for victory, lapse, no need for grandstanding. The truth had been stated, and the reaction had confirmed its impact. The job was done. The moment would live on far beyond that night. Clips would be replayed, discussions would continue, and those who had watched it unfold would remember it for a long time. Because in a world where political conversations were often rehearsed and controlled, this was something rare, something real. And no amount of spin, no carefully crafted response would ever be